is an operator's-only area. Pack your things and leave. Now. The voice wasn't raised. It wasn't angry. It was cold. Cold in the way of an order that doesn't require a reason. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask how she got in. He looked at her plain workout clothes and decided in his own mind that she didn't belong here. Did you hear me? This isn't a gym for outsiders. Or, which team is your husband on? Those questions weren't meant to be answered. They were meant to strip her of human worth, to place her exactly where he believed she belonged. She didn't respond. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply bent down and set the heavy barbell on the floor, cleanly, precisely, as if she had lived under far greater pressure many times before. Her silence didn't stop him. It convinced him that he had won. Silence doesn't mean you get to stay. This is a sealed gym, not a place for people who wander in. Around them, a few eyes began to turn. Some heard it. Some understood that something was wrong. But no one spoke. He stepped closer, his voice firmer, colder. I'm saying this for the last time. Leave. She remained still. No shaking. No retreat. And in that very moment, the moment he believed he had forced a woman to bow her head, he had no idea that he had just disrespected someone whom everyone on this base should have stood up to salute. If you believe that true courage is not found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to veterans' legacy stories so we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to the women veterans who were never properly named. Elena stood still, a half-finished water bottle in her hand, her fingers tightening slightly, but never trembling. Her eyes didn't drop, nor did they bore into the man facing her. They simply stayed where they were, steady and calm, the gaze of someone long accustomed to standing beneath unfair judgment without feeling the need to defend herself. She said nothing, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she understood something very clearly in moments like this. Words often only give contempt more room to exist. Did you hear me? The voice came again, not louder, but harder, as if her silence itself were an act of defiance. Elena still didn't respond. She twisted the cap of her bottle, took a small sip, then lowered her hand. It was a familiar gesture, repeated countless times throughout her life, each time someone looked at her and decided she was weaker, lesser, not worthy of being heard. Those years had taught her one thing, with absolute clarity: true value does not need to be shouted to be proven. Around them, the rhythm of the gym continued. Metal plates touched the floor. Shoes slid lightly. Heavy breaths filled the air as people focused on their own bodies. Yet beneath those familiar sounds, a thin, fragile tension began to spread, almost invisible, felt only by instinct. A few glances flicked over, then quickly away. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to be involved. Elena sensed it. She had been in rooms like this before, different places, different faces, but the same kind of silence. The silence of people who aren't cruel, but also aren't brave enough to stand on the right side. She didn't blame them. She understood the cost of disrupting surface order. This isn't a place for you to stand around. The voice continued, irritation now woven into it. If you're not on a team, you don't belong here. Elena slowly set the water bottle down on the bench beside her. The movement was clean, deliberate, without excess, every detail controlled. She didn't lift her head in challenge, nor did she step back. She stood exactly where she was, like someone who knew precisely where she stood in the world, not in the room, but within herself. She didn't justify herself. She didn't say she had access credentials. She didn't mention her mission, her title, or her past. Not because she couldn't, but because she knew some judgments are made before a story ever begins. And in those cases, reason is nothing more than a knock on a door already locked tight. A moment passed, then another. The lengthening silence didn't weaken Elena. It revealed something else, the impatience of the man standing in front of her. He wasn't used to having his orders go unanswered. He wasn't used to someone who didn't plead, didn't explain, didn't try to soothe his ego. Who do you think you are? The question burst out, no longer procedural, but personal. Elena lifted her head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. There was no anger there, no challenge. Only a calm that unsettled him more than any rebuttal could have. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Not out of fear, but because she knew that whatever answer she gave would not be something he was ready to hear. She stood there, like a still point, amid rising pressure. And it was precisely that stillness, her refusal to play this small, petty game of power, that unknowingly touched the most fragile part of him, a young ego fed more by authority than by understanding. That very silence, the thing Elena called dignity, became the spark that allowed contempt to gather itself, preparing to rise once more. Raynor smirked, thrust his hand out in front of Elena, and snatched the card she had just offered, as if it were an annoying object. He rolled it between two fingers, flipping it front and back, deliberately slowing the motion, so everyone nearby could see. A contractor card, his voice didn't need to be loud. It was clear enough. Looks like one of those mass-printed plastic cards. He chuckled softly, then looked up at her, the contempt in his eyes undisguised. No special markings, no unit listed. Doesn't say you're authorized to be in here. Elena remained still. She didn't reach out to take the card back. She let him keep talking as if she were already familiar with people who appointed themselves judge and jury. Want me to check the system? Raynor went on, then shook his head. Too bad. The system's down for maintenance. He said it quickly, too quickly for an official answer. It wasn't information. It was an excuse. An excuse created for one purpose only, to prove that he had the power to say no, and she had no right to question it. Rules are rules, he concluded, his voice firm. If you're not on the list, you don't belong here. Another man standing nearby turned, scanned Elena from head to toe, then laughed, half joking, half sneering, loud enough for others to hear. Yoga class is in the building next door. Might suit you better. A few scattered laughs followed. Not loud, not unified, but enough to form a thin layer of humiliation settling over the room. None of them looked directly at Elena as they laughed. They laughed to blend into the group, to reassure themselves that they were just bystanders, that this had nothing to do with them. Raynor heard the laughter and straightened his back. He felt the support, even if it was passive. It emboldened him. See, he said, a hint of mockery in his voice. No one here knows who you are. And honestly, that says a lot. Elena finally spoke. Her voice wasn't louder than before. It wasn't sharp. It didn't tremble. It was just one short, clear sentence stripped of excess emotion. I'm on assignment. The words fell into the space between them. No justification, no pleading, no extended explanation. Just a truth spoken plainly and calmly. Raynor laughed. Assignment. You sound like you're reading from a script. He handed the card back to her, but didn't let go, immediately holding it between them as a reminder of power. Your assignment doesn't give you the right to stand in this gym, and I'm under no obligation to believe a word you say. Elena reached out and took the card. She didn't look down at it. She didn't look at him any longer than necessary. She simply put it away, as if nothing in that exchange had shaken what was inside her. Raynor stepped half a pace closer. The distance between them closed. Do you understand the problem now? This isn't a misunderstanding anymore. This is about compliance. The laughter had faded, but the silence that remained was no longer neutral. It carried the scent of complicity. No one in the room spoke up. No one said it had gone too far. Each person chose to return to their own business, as if not seeing it meant it didn't exist. Elena stood there, surrounded by averted eyes, by words meant to exclude, by an atmosphere that was no longer innocent. She understood exactly what was happening. This was no longer about access cards or procedures. This was a public humiliation built layer by layer with intent. She said nothing more, not because there was nothing left to say, but because she recognized that a line had been crossed, a moral line. When people stop seeking understanding and begin seeking to diminish, when power is used to humiliate rather than to protect. And it was at that very moment, when the silence in the room ceased to be neutral, that a gaze from a distance settled on the scene, not to laugh, but to recognize that this could not continue any further. In an unobtrusive corner of the room, Master Chief Harris stood still, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes never leaving the area where the confrontation was unfolding. He didn't step in. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched. It was the habit of someone who had been around long enough to know that there are moments when true value only reveals itself if you remain silent and observe all the way to the end. He looked at Elena not with curiosity, but with deliberate attention. He noticed the way she kept her back straight, her center of gravity steady, her shoulders free of unnecessary tension. He saw how she set the barbell down, controlled, deliberate, never dropping it, never letting the metal strike the floor like an act of defiance. Every movement was clean, on tempo. There was no trace of impulsiveness or emotional reaction. This wasn't the posture of someone merely going through a workout. It was the posture of discipline forged over time in places where being off by a single beat could cost a life. Harris didn't need to hear Elena speak much. In truth, she barely spoke at all. That more than anything caught his attention. People who have never endured real pressure tend to over-explain. They fear being misunderstood. They fear being excluded. Elena didn't. She stood there as if the outcome had already been decided, and the only thing left was to let others reveal who they were. Harris's gaze passed briefly over Rayner, then returned to Elena. He saw impatience in every movement of the young petty officer. He saw an ego swelling with each sentence. But that wasn't what made him pause. What stopped him was the moment Elena turned her head slightly, just for an instant, enough for the line of her collar to shift. There, just beneath her ear, was a Valkyrie wing. It wasn't large. It wasn't showy. Just a black tattoo, sharp-lined, unadorned. But Harris didn't see it as a drawing. He saw it as a marker. A language not meant for the many. A sign recognized only by those who have stood very close to the boundary between life and death. His breathing slowed. Not in surprise, but in memory. He had seen that tattoo before. Not often. Perhaps only once. On the wrist of someone who never came back. On the shoulder of someone whose name never appeared in the news. It wasn't a unit insignia. It wasn't an issued badge. It was something that appeared only after everything was over, when those who survived needed a way to remember what could never be spoken aloud. Harris looked at Elena again. This time he wasn't looking at her stance. He wasn't watching her movements. He was seeing her silence differently. It was no longer endurance. It was control. A conscious choice not to step into an unnecessary confrontation. The dignity of someone who knows exactly what she has already been through. He didn't need to ask. He didn't need to verify anything in that moment. Professional instinct told him one thing clearly. If a Valkyrie wing appeared here, this was no longer a matter between a young petty officer and a woman being dismissed. It had moved beyond the personal. Harris turned away. Not hurried, not drawing attention. He stepped out of the space as if he were simply changing workout stations. But his hand had already reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone fingers, accustomed to dialing numbers in situations where there was no margin for error. He paused for a second. Just 1 second. Long enough to be certain he wasn't mistaken. Long enough to know that some calls require very little explanation. He selected a name from his contacts, a name no one calls without just cause. And while everyone else still believed this was nothing more than a minor dispute, the balance of power had already begun to shift, quietly but irreversibly. Rayner stepped half a pace closer. He didn't need to touch Elena. He was close enough for the distance itself to become a warning. His shoulders tightened, his chest pushed forward, the familiar posture of someone who believed his body was part of his authority. He didn't speak right away. He let the pressure of his proximity do the talking. "Do you understand what you're doing?" His voice dropped lower. "You're standing in our space." Elena didn't step back. She didn't move forward either. She remained still, as if the distance between them didn't exist at all. Her gaze didn't avoid him, but it didn't challenge him either. It simply stayed there, calm enough to make the person facing her uncomfortable. Rayner tilted his head, his eyes sliding up to her neck. He raised a hand, not touching her, but pointing directly at the small tattoo visible beneath the edge of her collar. "And what about that A tattoo? You think that makes you look tough in this gym?" He gave a short laugh. "This isn't a bar. This isn't a place to show off cheap symbols." A few people nearby looked up. No one spoke. The air felt compressed, thin, and sharp. Rayner's words were no longer about procedure. They had turned into deliberate personal judgment. Elena took a slow breath. Not deep, not long. Just enough to keep her voice steady. This was the first time she spoke since the mockery had taken on the shape of a threat. "I'm authorized to be here." Her voice wasn't louder than the sounds around them. It didn't tremble. It wasn't rigid. "You can verify it. Or step aside." There was no exclamation point in her words. No challenge. No defense. Just a fact offered as a simple choice. Verify. Or move aside. The sentence didn't stop Rayner, but it did freeze him for a brief moment, long enough for his ego to register a confrontation he hadn't expected. Not a confrontation of volume. One of certainty. "You're not in a position to make demands," he shot back faster than necessary. "I don't need to verify anything." His hand moved toward his pocket. "You're trespassing." and it's my duty to handle this. Elena's expression didn't change. She had heard these words before, in other places, under different circumstances. When power is challenged, it often disguises itself as duty. You're taking this too far, someone whispered from behind, too quietly, to become intervention. Raynor didn't turn around. I'm calling security, he said more loudly, as if to reassert control in front of the watching eyes. They'll escort you out, and then we'll see whether your credentials are even real. The threat landed clearly, cold and final. There was no path back, no gray area left. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a decision. Elena gave a very slight nod. Not agreement, not acceptance, just acknowledgement. She understood that the final line had been crossed. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. She knew that from this moment on, the situation was no longer in the hands of the two people standing face to face. Raynor pulled out his phone. His finger hovered over the screen, ready to dial, convinced the system would stand behind him, that the familiar order would shield him from any consequence. And in that very moment when Raynor believed he was about to end this story, with a single call, he had no idea that a far greater truth was already on its way in carrying the full weight of honor and things that could no longer be dismissed. Harris pressed the phone to his ear, his voice low and precise, without preamble, without lengthy explanation. He knew the person on the other end understood this language. Sir, he said slowly and clearly, she has a Valkyrie tattoo. On the other end of the line, there were no questions, no laughter. Just a very brief pause, long enough for Harris to know the message had been received. When the reply came, the tone had changed completely. It was no longer the voice of someone busy. It was the voice of someone who had just been reminded of something that could not be taken lightly. I'm on my way, came the decisive response without further explanation. Harris ended the call. He didn't turn back to look at Elena. He didn't need to. He knew she was still standing there as composed as she had been from the start. He simply stepped back one pace, allowing the space to continue operating on its own momentum, while something else was shifting at a deeper level. Raynor was still standing in front of Elena, phone in hand, convinced he still held the upper hand. He didn't realize that from the moment those words were spoken, power had already moved away from its familiar place. He said a few more things about procedure, about security, about responsibility, but his words began to fall into emptiness. Not because Elena argued back, but because the space around them no longer supported those words. A change spread, quiet but unmistakable. Familiar sounds slowed. Eyes stopped darting away. A few people straightened as if instinct warned them that something was about to unfold, far beyond this small confrontation. Then the door opened. No one needed to call for order. The presence of the man who entered did that on its own. The base commander appeared posture straight, steps firm, his eyes sweeping the room before stopping on Elena. At his side was the Command Master Chief, his stern face carrying the weight of decades of service in every line. No one spoke. No one smiled. No one remained in a relaxed stance. Everyone in the room understood exactly what this meant. The silence was no longer avoidance. It became absolute attention. The commander took a few more steps and stopped in front of Elena. He didn't ask questions. He didn't verify credentials. He didn't ask her to explain herself. He looked at her for a brief moment, long enough to see her composure, long enough to notice the small mark on her neck that Harris had mentioned. Then he came to attention. A sharp, decisive movement. A gesture not meant for civilians. He raised his hand and saluted Elena. That moment cut through every remaining assumption in the room. A commander does not salute someone undeserving. A base does not stop for a mistake. What was happening here was not an exception. It was recognition. Raynor stood frozen. At some point, his phone slipped lower in his hand, without him realizing it. Everything he believed to be right, certain, unquestionable, had just been overturned without a single reprimand. The commander lowered his hand. His voice carried across the room deep and clear. Elena, he said, calling her by name, on behalf of this base, I offer my sincere apology for what you have just experienced. Elena gave a slight nod, not to accept the apology, only to acknowledge that she had heard it. She still didn't say much. She never needed to say much in the moments that mattered most. If you believe that there are women who have served this country in silence, carrying immense responsibility, without needing to be seen, subscribe to veterans' legacy stories, so that together we may remember the dignity, memory, and reverence owed to the women in uniform, who were never properly named. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. Eyes that once held mockery now carried confusion. Those who had remained silent now understood that their silence had just been exposed. The balance of power had reversed without noise, without argument, through a single timely gesture. And as this new silence spread heavy and solemn, the truth Elena carried began to prepare itself to be spoken, not to be displayed, but to restore everything to its rightful place. The commander stood straight, his voice lowering, no longer addressed to a single individual, but to everyone present in the room. "So there is no further misunderstanding," he said slowly. "I will make it clear who she is." The space fell utterly silent. Not a single unnecessary sound. Those who had just witnessed the shift in power now understood they were standing before a truth they could not turn away from. Elena Parker, the commander continued, is not an outsider. She is a former signals intelligence analyst who served directly in special operations. Rayner stood motionless. His eyes no longer searched for validation from anyone. They were empty, as if every assumption he had been standing on had just been pulled out from beneath him. She was assigned to provide direct support to Task Force Neptune. The commander went on without emphasis, without dramatization, yet every word carried its own weight. A unit whose missions rarely, if ever, appear in public reports. A few people in the room swallowed quietly. The name needed no explanation. It carried its own authority. The commander paused briefly, then continued, his voice steady, as if stating an administrative fact rather than telling a story meant to impress. During an operation in the Kunar Valley, when a strike team was pinned down under heavy fire, all communications were jammed. He looked around the room, ensuring everyone was listening. The support helicopter was hit. Both primary and backup communication systems were down. Short sentences. Clean. No embellishment needed. In that situation, he continued, it was Elena Parker who identified the source of the jamming. She did so while the aircraft was under fire with no guarantee that they would land safely. Elena remained still. She did not react. She did not lower her head. She did not deny it. She had heard these words before behind closed doors in rooms with far fewer people. She did not need to relive that moment here. Based on the information she provided, the commander said the team was able to locate the enemy, and the entire unit withdrew safely. He paused, then delivered the next line more distinctly, like a final period. Not a single member of that team was killed. The silence in the room was no longer tense. It became attentive. A few eyes turned toward Elena, not with curiosity, but with something closer to reverence. Her record, the commander continued, is largely redacted, but what remains is enough. He turned slightly toward the Command Master Chief and gave a small nod. 3 Silver Star medals, awarded for actions during missions we do not discuss publicly. Rayner felt his chest tighten. 3 silver stars. The number did not need repeating. It echoed on its own in his mind, pressing down on every word he had spoken, before every joke, every sneer, every finger he had pointed at a tattoo he once dismissed as cheap. He could no longer stand fully upright. His shoulders sagged. His gaze dropped. Not because he had been reprimanded, not because he had been threatened, but because for the first time he truly understood what he had disrespected. The commander looked directly at Rayner. His voice was not raised. It was not harsh. "Petty officer," he said, "this is not a story about punishment." He turned back to Elena, then addressed the entire room. "This is a story about standards, about what we choose to measure others by." Elena finally spoke. Just one sentence. Her voice was low, even carrying no sense of victory. "No one knows everything," she said, "but we can choose how we treat one another." The words settled into the room like a reminder aimed at no one person, yet meant for everyone, and with the truth placed where it belonged, not to punish, but to illuminate. The room began to move into a different phase where the lesson no longer lay in disciplinary action, but in how each person would choose to carry this memory forward. What followed was not loud, nor did it resemble a public sentence. It unfolded quietly, just as true legacies so often do. Rayner's position was adjusted not to remove him, but to retrain him. He was placed into additional instruction on unit history, on the roles of those who stood behind operations, whose names never appeared on honor boards. There were no extended reprimands, no public shaming, only lessons that forced him to confront the gaps in his own understanding. At the same time, a new protocol was issued across the base. Electronic verification became mandatory for everyone. No exceptions, no judgment by appearance, no room left for emotion or personal bias. The screen displayed only 2 outcomes, authorized or denied. Authority was returned to the system, where individuals could no longer impose subjective views onto others. Time passed. People spoke less and less about what had happened that day. But the lesson remained. It seeped into how people looked at one another, into the questions asked before conclusions were drawn, into the care taken when judging a person by appearance alone. A few weeks later, on a quiet afternoon, Rainer found Elena. The excessive confidence was gone. The posture of someone accustomed to giving orders was gone. He stood straight, but his shoulders were slightly lowered like someone carrying something heavier than rank. "Ma'am," he spoke first, his voice low and clear. "I want to apologize." Elena looked up at him. Her eyes did not probe. They did not accuse. They simply listened. "What I said that day was wrong," Rainer continued. "I didn't understand, and I didn't show respect." Elena gave a very small nod. She didn't prolong the moment. She didn't need further explanation. "Thank you for saying it," she replied calmly. Rainer hesitated for a second, then continued as if he needed to finish the thought. "I'm learning again. About history. About people like you." Elena paused briefly, then said the only sentence she felt was necessary. "Judge skill, not appearance." It wasn't a lecture. It wasn't a reprimand. Just a principle. Something that should have been learned early on yet is sometimes only understood after the cost of personal shame. Rainer nodded, not to end the conversation, but to remember. Elena left afterward. No one stopped her. No one asked her to stand at the center again. She returned to her familiar role, continuing her work in silence just as she always had. No need for attention. No need for praise. She did not seek recognition. She left behind something far more real, a change in how those around her saw the world. Her legacy does not live in medals blacked out in classified files. It lives in people who learned to pause before judging, in decisions made with greater fairness, in eyes no longer quick to exclude. Legacy is not a rank that makes others bow. Legacy is how we teach those who come after us to respect the right person at the right time. If this story leads you to view the women who serve in uniform with deeper respect, subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories, so together we may remember forgotten memories, unspoken dignity, and the silent courage of women heroes who were never properly named. Veterans Legacy Stories, we remember the quiet heroes.